under new legislation due this autumn. Hospital bosses will also be compelled to give evidence to an inquiry over why they ignored doctors' warnings. Also tonight, a 5-metre storm surge and 125-mile-an-hour winds as Hurricane Idalia sweeps across Florida. Plus, Ukraine's symbolic and strategic drone strikes inside Russia, the largest since the war began. The handshake in Beijing creating a rift in government here, with MPs demanding the UK take a tougher stance on China.
I didn't have that support structure, that network, or that expert advice to identify what was actually going on with me.
Prince Harry recounts what he describes as his unravelling after serving in Afghanistan as he prepares to host the Invictus Games. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's coming up in our press preview from 10:30. Hello, good evening. Serial murderer Lucy Letby is the worst child killer in the UK. And after her conviction today, the government moved on 2 fronts to appease angry and grieving families. NHS managers at Chester Hospital will now be compelled to give evidence at a statutory inquiry after doctors claimed their warnings were ignored. More on that shortly. And after the neonatal nurse repeatedly refused to face the parents of the 7 babies she killed, prison officers will be given further powers to use reasonable force to drag criminals into the dock. But one criminal judge has warned those new laws risk turning the courtroom into a circus, as Sky's political correspondent Liz Bates reports.
Some of the nation's most depraved killers, too cowardly to look their victims in the eye and hear the devastation their crimes have caused, will no longer be able to hide, according to the Prime Minister.
There shouldn't be an easy way out, and that's why we're going to change the law so that courts can compel these offenders to be present for their sentencing and to hear the impact that their actions have had, but also, if necessary, to use reasonable force to bring those people to court and also to add time onto their sentence if they don't appear.
First promised by him back in July 2022, but in the wake of Lucy Letby's refusal to attend court, Rishi Sunak says it will now be enshrined in law, part of the King's speech in November. Not soon enough, though, for the mother of Liam Curry, who was murdered in the Manchester bombings in 2017.
I, Hashim Abedi, state as follows.
The killer, Hashim Abedi, was absent for the verdict.
Once that guilty verdict comes, for me, then your choice should be removed. My child wasn't given a choice. When you decided to do what you did, my child's choice was irrelevant. So I'm afraid when you are found guilty, your choice should become irrelevant too. You should appear in that dock and take what's coming.
Judges do already have some powers. They can extend sentences for those who don't show up, but don't currently force them into the dock, raising questions over how this will work in practice.
Of course, some of them will sit there quietly and listen and take it all on board, but there will be people who come into court in handcuffs, shouting and screaming, declaring their innocence, disrupting the proceedings. And it's very difficult to know how a judge is expected to deal with that without making the whole exercise into some sort of circus.
For the victims who have long campaigned for this change, like the mother of Olivia Corbell, who was shot in Liverpool last year, they will never get their moment in court, but hope others now will. Liz Bates, Sky News, Westminster.
So those changes to how criminals will be sentenced after Lucy Letby's murders. Today, the Health Secretary insisted his priority was to seek answers for the families.
When I announced that we would have an independent inquiry, I was very clear that we would shape that inquiry around the wishes of the families. My priority is to ensure that the families get the answers they deserve, that people are held to account where they need to be.
Let's go live to Westminster and our chief political correspondent, John Craig. So, John, the Health Secretary describing the Letby crimes as truly harrowing, and now prisoners to be forced into the docks and witnesses compelled to give evidence.
Well, Mr Barclay's announcement that he's going for a full-blown public inquiry came just a few hours after that announcement about the sentencing shake-up. Now, Mr Barclay has bowed to pressure from the families and their lawyers, the bereaved families, the murdered victims of Lucy Letby, who've been demanding pretty loudly a full-blown public inquiry with real teeth that can demand that witnesses give evidence, compel them legally to give evidence, and also demand papers, emails, phone messages, all sorts of records be handed over, just as they're being handed over to the big COVID inquiry right now. Mr Barclay has also announced that he's looking at measures could be taken in the interim, as he says. Now, he's probably referring here to a move by Amanda Pritchard, the boss of NHS England. She was speaking last week in a letter to NHS Trust bosses about a new system of regulation for hospital bosses, managers, directors, bureaucrats who were accused in Chester, of course, of ignoring the warnings of doctors and nurses about Lucy Letby. She says it's the time to look at regulation and for the public to have confidence in the NHS and the way it's run. There's got directors and hospital bosses have got to be made accountable for their actions. So that's in the short term, but a long-term public inquiry. But it's what the families want to get at the truth. And of course, Mr Barclay's talked about whistleblowers. Well, they're going to have their say.
John, thank you. To Florida now, where at least 2 people have died after Hurricane Idalia swept through the state, bringing powerful winds and potentially life-threatening storm surges. It began its journey off the coast of Cuba, developing into a tropical storm last week. It strengthened into a Category 4 hurricane as it moved up the Gulf of Mexico, weakening slightly as it made landfall on Florida's Big Bend, with winds of 125 miles an hour. Well, it's forecast to continue through Georgia and South Carolina at Category 1 strength before losing strength again over the Atlantic. Our US correspondent James Matthews is live in Crystal River, Florida. James.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Anna. I'm in Crystal River, the centre of town, and you can see behind me some of the effects of flooding in parts of Florida, the so-called Big Bend, just to the left of the Panhandle. Hurricane Idalia was the strongest hurricane to make landfall in 125 years. For a population here, it's been 24 hours of evacuations, rescues, and of survival. They know a hurricane in Florida, not that it makes this any easier. This was the so-called storm surge. In Cedar Key, water several feet high was thrown ashore as the hurricane made landfall. Florida was a state blown sideways once more as Idalia blew in. This was the main bridge to and from the city of Tampa, closed due to flooding as waves crashed over the roadway. Hundreds of thousands of people were without electricity. We filmed one reason why. Branches blown onto power lines caused power outages across the state. Idalia caused extensive flooding inland. This was the scene in the town of Crystal River. It was all but deserted as the hurricane combined with high tide to land communities several feet deep in water. Marine life swam in residential streets. We saw insects cling to a football for survival. Amidst guidance to evacuate, there were residents who'd chosen to stay put, like Leslie Garrison and her family, fighting a losing battle against the floodwater.
The hurricane was nothing. It's the flooding you have to worry about. So once it floods your house, it's a pain. It really is. Even though you have insurance and everything, it's still not enough.
As the satellite imagery showed the power of Idalia and its destination, Florida, a number of counties across the state were under evacuation orders. Many amongst its population decanted to shelter, hunkered down on higher ground.
Unfortunately, it'll probably take my house. So you got to run.
You've got 5 properties.
5, yeah. I put my retirement in it, and you got to roll the dice sometimes, and it is what it is, I guess.
And you were told that this was a life or death decision to get to a place like this.
Absolutely. You can hide from wind, but you got to run from water.
Of course, they're familiar with hurricanes in Florida. There is a hurricane season here. But in the days before Hurricane Idalia, people in parts of this state were warned they would be facing some of the worst weather conditions they'd ever known. Flooding extended across the state line. This was how it looked at Valdosta in Georgia. Back in Florida, this was Clearwater Beach with Idalia adaptations.
The impacts of this storm are being felt throughout the southeast, even as it moves up the eastern coast of the United States, affecting Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And we have to remain vigilant, and there's much more to do.
The damage has been widespread here. Its full extent will become clear after the hurricane has blown through. Only when they resurface in the Sunshine State will they know its full impact. President Joe Biden saying in the past couple of hours that there is no denying the climate crisis contributed to the scenario we are witnessing here in Florida. It's certainly the case that Hurricane Idalia travelled fast, largely as a result of the conditions that fueled its power, high sea temperatures and all. It is a blessing that in the path of the hurricane largely were rural areas. Had urban areas, highly populated areas been hit, then the casualty count could have been far greater. It has been bad. 2 men have died in car accidents that are described as weather-related. Hurricane Idalia has moved on. It has crossed the state line. It arrived in Florida as Category 3. It's moved on to the state of Georgia as Category 1. It's disappeared from here, but it remains a danger.
James, live there in Florida. Thank you. The UK's rollout of flu and coronavirus vaccines has been brought forward after the emergence of a new COVID variant. NHS officials have indicated that the latest COVID variant is the most concerning since the arrival of Omicron. Vaccination efforts aimed at care home residents and those who are immunocompromised will now start on the 11th of September rather than in October. A 2-year-old girl has died after being struck by a car at a holiday park in Cambridgeshire. Isabella Tucker was taken to Kings Lynn Hospital after the incident last Friday, but she died of her injuries. A 42-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving. The Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire Police has paid her respects to police officer Graham Saville, who died after he was hit by a train while trying to save a man's life on a railway line in Newark. His death was described as an enormous shock.
Sergeant Graham Saville was a hugely respected and popular colleague, and his death in the line of duty has come as an enormous shock to us all. When a colleague dies in the line of duty, the sadness is felt by the entire policing family, and we will all sadly mourn our colleague Graham together.
Ukrainian drones are again being downed over Russia tonight after what's thought to be its biggest coordinated assault on Kremlin territory since the start of the war. There are also reports that 6 Ukrainian servicemen have been killed in an accident involving 2 helicopters. We'll bring you more on that story as it develops. Here's Sky's international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, on Kyiv's strategic and symbolic victory.
For more and more Russians, the war is coming closer to home. In 6 cities, Ukrainian drones wreaked havoc. The most spectacular attack in Pskov. Huge walls of smoke lit up by explosions on the ground. Attacks condemned angrily by the Russian government, accusing the West of being complicit.
Ukrainian drone attacks on peaceful and civilian targets once again confirm the terrorist nature of the Kyiv regime. It is also clear that Ukrainian drones simply would not be able to fly such a distance without carefully researched information from Western satellites.
Ukraine came under heavy attack itself from Russian drones and missiles overnight. But its attacks on Russia are more significant because they show it's enhancing its drone capability. In recent months, targeting the electricity supply in Belgorod, oil facilities in Krasnodar and infrastructure in Crimea, including the Kerch Bridge. Then increasing its range to hit Russia's capital, Moscow. But this was the biggest drone operation yet, striking 6 cities across western and southern Russia. The furthest was Pskov, hundreds of miles north of Ukraine. Transporter planes photographed there 2 weeks ago are vital for Russia's war effort to ferry troops and arms to the front line. This is what's now left of some of them. And the attack comes as Ukraine's counter-offensive is putting Russian defences under more and more pressure.
Just when you're hitting them hard down on the main actual battle line, you then hit someone behind the lines, and that creates some pretty significant strategic effect, I think. It's putting a pretty clear message to the Russians that you can run but you can't hide. We can strike you pretty much anywhere.
Vladimir Putin told his people his invasion was vital to keep them safe. Ukrainians are using drones to prove the opposite is true, with increasingly devastating effect. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Now they travelled through 3 capital cities, 4 airports and 2 continents. Paul Rhodes and his family made the epic journey just to return to the UK from Romania after their flights were cancelled. Today there are calls for the National Air Traffic Service and not the airlines to foot the £100 million estimated bill needed to compensate thousands of passengers. Rachel Venables has more.
So this is our epic journey home.
This wasn't how Paul planned to get home.
It's some kind of truck stop in the middle of northeastern Romania.
But when Monday's NATS outage cancelled his family's flight from Bucharest to London, they were determined to get back by any means necessary, beginning with a 9-hour bus journey to Moldova.
First leg of the journey done. We set off at about 9:30 this morning, and now it's midnight here in Moldova, and we're all pretty knackered.
Then booking a flight to Istanbul on Wednesday night, before finally flying to Stansted on Thursday morning.
As my son put it this morning, we're going to be 3 capital cities, 4 airports, and 2 continents to get home to London from Bucharest.
Getting them home 48 hours late and at a cost of about £1,400. It's thought this whole saga could end up costing airlines close to £100 million.
So it's very clear that the cause of this problem was completely outside of the control of airlines, and yet they will be responsible for carrying the bill. So we believe that this is a great example of why this legislation needs to be reviewed and where compensation is paid by the people who caused the problem. And in this case, the problem very clearly caused by NATS.
Plane schedules are slowly returning to normal, but there have been fresh cancellations affecting yet more passengers. On Wednesday, at least 42 flights to and from Heathrow were axed as questions mount about how such a catastrophic failure could have been caused by a bit of dodgy data. NATS insist the glitch has been fixed and won't be repeated, but many in the industry are nervous as stranded travellers fight to get home. Rachel Venables, Sky News, Heathrow.
It's the handshake in Beijing causing a rift in the Conservative government in Westminster. Foreign Secretary James Cleverley today insisted diplomacy would deliver as he visited China and raised concerns on human rights abuses and crackdowns on democracy. But many in his party are demanding that ministers take a tougher stance, with one former leader even comparing the UK's current approach to appeasement. Sky's Asia correspondent Helen Ansmith has this report from Beijing.
This place is the very centre of Chinese power and political theatre. The Great Hall of the People, heavily securitised, closely watched. And it's been a 5-year wait since a British Foreign Secretary was welcomed here. But that changed today. Greetings with the Vice President Hang Zhong cordial enough, and a clear desire from both to up their engagement.
Talks are now underway and there is a lot at stake. It feels like the Foreign Secretary is coming here to seek something of a reset in the UK-China relationship after a period that's been largely characterised by growing distrust and disagreement.
Disagreements that may have been more keenly felt in the day's second meeting. Wang Yi, known for his tough talk and diplomacy, just listened to his subtle critique of more sceptical voices.
We've also noticed that from time to time there have been some noises in the Sino-British relationship, and some people have even questioned your visit to Beijing.
And there is much that now divides them. China's veiled support for Putin's war in Ukraine, aggression towards Taiwan, and of course, human rights crackdowns, both here in Hong Kong and against the Uyghur minority in northwestern Xinjiang.
Hello, how are you?
Questions over whether the UK is taking a tough enough stance.
I've had a number of conversations with senior representatives of the Chinese government, and I have raised human rights in every single one of those meetings.
But raising is not enough, is it? I mean, you know that words in meetings aren't going to change their course on this sort of stuff. You know, why are we not doing more?
But what suggestion would you put forward?
Well, for example, you could ban the import of cotton from Xinjiang.
We do, of course, have an economic relationship with China, just as the US does, just as other countries do. But where security is at odds with economics, the security will always win out.
But there's criticism too about muddled policy and two damning reports from fellow MPs.
The government's policy is confusing and incoherent. That's the verdict of the Cross-Party Intelligence Security Committee and the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. We have wanted to see a strategic, long-term strategy from the government, but all we've had is confusing, mixed messages.
Just round the corner from the British Embassy in Beijing, people were just getting on with their lives. But debate is rife about how to deal with the China of today and tomorrow. Helen Ann Smith, Sky News in Beijing.
Now to the news of the 8th coup in Western Central Africa since 2020. Military leaders in oil-rich Gabon seized power and put the president under house arrest just hours after he was declared to have officially won a third term in office. Sky's Africa correspondent Yusra El Bahir has this report.
Another day, another military coup in Africa. This time in the Central African country, Gabon, where crowds are celebrating the toppling of 14-year President Ali Bongo, whose family have held power since 1967. A mutiny that unfolded shortly after his re-election announcement.
Les élections générales du 26 août 2023.
The general elections of August the 28th, 2023, as well as its falsified results, are cancelled. Borders are closed until further notice, and all the institutions of the Republic are dissolved.
Hours later, a video surfaced of their former president under house arrest, appealing on the world stage for intervention.
I'm to send a message to all the friends that we have all over the world, to tell them to make noise, For the people here have arrested me and my family.
Coups are sweeping across the continent at a rapid pace. Chad, Sudan, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and now Gabon. Most of them francophone countries battling with increasing anti-French sentiments, instability, economic strife, and powerful militaries. Experts believe that more countries will follow.
France has been encouraging and supporting presidential extensions in all of its former colonies. And that's what we find this wave of anti-French sentiment against the democratic coups that have undermined democracy. Cameroon is looking likely, Ivory Coast maybe, Togo maybe, Senegal maybe.
Another domino has fallen, swiftly and without bloodshed. And while the people celebrate the shift in the status quo, leaders across Africa are likely shifting in their seats, as the question echoes, who will fall next? Yusra El Bahir, Sky News.
After big value deals and high-profile moves, the football transfer window closes this Friday. The headline stats have been record-breaking, and analysis by Sky News and Sky Sports News reveals just how much costs have increased. But when football inflation is factored in, the most expensive player in the Premier League is not who you'd think. Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire can explain more.
It's not just the suit that's from another era. When Rio Ferdinand signed for Manchester United in 2002 for £29 million, it was a Premier League transfer record. Fast forward 2 decades, and that would buy you about a quarter of Moises Caicedo, the new record signed by Chelsea this summer for £115 million. Footballers are often treated like pieces in the great transfer game. The question is, are we valuing them correctly across the ages? The Sky data team have adjusted the figures for inflation to reveal who really cost the most.
On paper, Moises Caicedo, the most expensive signing in Premier League history, but that's not the only way of looking at this in terms of value.
115 million would have got you, 4 or 5 of the best players in the world a few years ago. Now it gets you one defensive midfielder. A pint would cost you 50 quid now if they'd increased at the same rate as Premier League footballers had since the start of the Premier League. A loaf of bread would be about 25 quid and a pint of milk would be more than a tenner.
By sticker price, these are the 5 most expensive signings. Moises Caicedo through to Romelu Lukaku. But if you adjust for inflation, well, this is the new top 5. Andriy Shevchenko in first place. He cost £31 million in 2006. That will be worth £215 million now. We've got Rio Ferdinand there and Alan Shearer. Well, he'd be worth nearly £178 million today. He cost just £15 million in 1996. We can also look at which clubs have spent the most adjusted for inflation. The story of money and power in the league. Blackburn Rovers falling down, so do Newcastle. As we get new entrants, Chelsea coming in under the Roman Abramovich era and starting to spend big. Manchester City too, they're coming up the leagues as they're taken over. And then we start to look a lot like what's referred to as traditionally the Big Six in terms of spending and in terms of league position.
We have now clubs which are owned by countries or owners from other countries who have a lot of money and are also able to invest this into football. And then you have TV contracts which are completely different to TV contracts 20 years ago.
And after a COVID lull, transfer fees increased again this summer. With Saudi cash now arriving too, there's even more money on the table. Tom Cheshire, Sky News.
It has been, in his own words, his biggest struggle. Prince Harry today describing how he unravelled after returning home from his tour of Afghanistan, as he put it, with no support structure and no one who could really help. He opened up in a documentary, potentially resetting his global brand, as our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock, reports.
Here we are.
What's your name?
My name's Harry.
He's back. But this show's not about Harry, it's about Invictus.
Brought a rucksack and everything.
Nice neck of the woods, this.
Should we go for a hike?
It's a homecoming for Harry, back on comfortable territory. And with a military career behind him, it's also deeply personal.
There was an unravelling. And the trigger to me was actually returning from Afghanistan. But the stuff that was coming up was from 1997, from the age of 12. Losing my mum at such a young age. The trauma that I had, I was never really aware of. It was never discussed. I didn't really talk about it. The biggest struggle for me was the people, no one around me really could help. I didn't have that support structure, that network.
And that's why Harry launched the Games in 2014. His belief and support, a lifeline for veterans. Including Julian Allen competing in this year's Games.
What he has done for veterans and service personnel is outstanding. He's changing and saving many lives. Thanks to what Prince Harry has done, he's actually give people belief that, yes, you can do things. Yeah, we might be broken, but we just find other ways on how we can, move forward.
We'll see Prince Harry at next month's Invictus Games in Dusseldorf, now with increasing participants from Ukraine.
I hope they feel welcomed. I hope they feel uplifted and energised, because at the end of these games, they're the ones that are going to have to go back to a war zone. And that worries me, it troubles me.
This is Prince Harry moving forward, a change of direction after months of negative headlines. Nick Eade is a charity consultant who's worked with the Duchess of Sussex.
This is an opportunity for people to fall in love with the man they know is so passionate about veterans and so passionate about what he does. And hopefully that will allow his currency to become more valuable as the years go on.
Even critics agree Invictus is Harry's success story. It could also now be a springboard to rebuilding his reputation. Laura Bundock, Sky News.
And we'll end tonight on rare images of a rather unusual event, a blue supermoon. You can see here how bright and how much bigger the moon appears in the night sky in Hampshire. Can you see that from the telly? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's because it's near the closest point in its orbit around Earth. It's described as blue because it's the second full moon in one calendar month. There won't be another one until 2037. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by the Daily Mirror's Associate Editor, Kevin Maguire, and the former Conservative Special Advisor, Anita Boateng. Well, among the issues we'll be discussing, this story on the front of the Metro about criminals being forced to appear now for sentencing. The headline, "We'll see you in court, cowards." Back with that and more. Well, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, a reminder of our top stories this evening. Ministers have ordered a statutory inquiry into the crimes of killer nurse Lucy Letby, in which witnesses can be compelled to give evidence. They also announced plans to give judges in England and Wales new powers to order offenders to attend sentencing. 2 people have died and homes have been flooded after Hurricane Idalia made landfall in Florida. It's now weakened to a tropical storm and is sweeping across the state of Georgia. And Russian officials have said drone attacks that targeted 6 regions will not go unpunished. The strikes have been described as the biggest coordinated assault on Russian territory since the start of the war. Hello there, watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines then with, tonight, the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the former Conservative special advisor, Anita Boateng. Welcome and great to see both of you. So to the front pages then, let us start with the Metro reacting to the government's intention to introduce new powers, forcing convicted criminals to attend their sentencing. The Metro has this headline: "We'll see you in court, cowards." The decision welcomed too by the Daily Mail with this headline: "At last, killers will have to face justice." It's also the lead story for the Daily Express. The Guardian, meanwhile, has news that witnesses will be forced to give evidence to the inquiry into the handling of the Lucy Letby killings by health officials. The Times reports that police officers are to be automatically sacked if found guilty of gross misconduct or a criminal offence, under new powers to be introduced. With his autumn statement due soon, the Eye says the Chancellor has ruled out any tax cuts this year, which it says will anger many Tory MPs. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers for yourself while listening to our guests. So let's head straight to them, to Kevin Maguire and Anita Boateng. And Anita, why don't you start off then, the different elements of the Lucy Letby story. The Daily Mail picking up on this idea that killers will have to be dragged into the dock to hear their sentencing.
Yes, and we do know that there are some ways in which that can already happen, but basically this is a new piece of legislation the government is bringing in that's been under conversation for a while now, and it's going to basically give judges new powers to sort of explicitly order these offenders to be present in the courtroom when sentencing is happening. It makes it clearer in law that reasonable force can be used in order to make that a reality, to sort of empower prison officers to be able to get these offenders into court to sort of hear and be sentenced and hear the judge's verdict.
Yes, and the Prison Officers Association making clear that those powers do exist now, but often not directed strongly enough by the judge. And their feeling is that this could be extremely disruptive, not least to the victims' families who are sitting there watching, you know, what could end up being a circus.
Yeah, no, the victims' families hope they see the convicted crushed, very contrite. But what if they're going to be laughing, smirking, sneering, making hand signals, disrupting it? So, look, my own paper, the Daily Mirror, has been campaigning on this for months for it to happen because of the public backlash. It'll be hugely, hugely popular, but the powers are there now. And I think the reason they're rarely used is judges are using their discretion in courtrooms. Of course, judges think they should. The guilty should be there to hear the impact from family of their crimes and for their sentencing. But, of course, judges realise there are going to be problems here. And listening to the national chair of the Prison Officers Association earlier, watching him on Sky News, I thought he was just very good because, of course, he backs the powers, but he says maybe one way around it and stopping the families having to listen to abuse from the guilty is to pipe in the statements into a cell, and you can turn off the sound so you don't hear them screaming abuse back at you. But no, I mean, look, I'm with the government on this. Labour have been pushing it, the Daily Mirror has been pushing it, victims groups have been pushing it, families have been pushing it, but there are problems undoubtedly.
And actually, one of the cases that the Daily Mail has picked up on, this man, bottom left, Thomas Cashman, one of those who did not appear, and the victim in this case was 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Cobell. You know, her mother's been campaigning hard on this, and it's, you know, all very well piping it down to the cells, but it's like the families need to see the faces of the person who did this to their relatives.
Yes, I think that's true, but I think that it's sort of what do you want from that? You want them to sort of feel the impact of what they've actually done, not be able to turn away. But I think there is a world in which those offenders are brought kicking and screaming, you know, saying all sorts of things happen. Once a verdict is read, they could laugh, they could do all sorts of things that could then re-traumatised. So I think, I mean, to be clear, the powers are coming in, and absolutely it's really important that there's now more of a conversation, more of a consideration that judges will be taking about this specific issue of sentencing and presence there, but they still have discretion. So judges are still going to be able to say, well, in this instance, what my sense is that the families will be, I don't know, re-traumatised if this happens, or there are concerns about, I don't know, safety or all the other things that come into play in a courtroom. So I think that's quite an important element of this reform.
I've nothing against dragging the convicted into the dock and handcuffing them, but how far do you want to go after that? Do you want to be gagging them? I mean, how would that look? Now, Olivia Pratt-Corbels, who was the 9-year-old shot in her home in Liverpool, her mother said, well, if they scream, so be it. Not everybody will take the view. And I look at Lucy Letby's victims, the parents of those babies. I think it could have added to their trauma if Lucy Letby kicked off in some way in the dock. I'm not saying she would, but she wouldn't go. And I understood why they wanted her there. You would.
Well, to hear their victim statements, they're now called personal statements
absolutely.
as well.
But I think the judges will still have to have some discretion, because the threat of an extra 2 years, if one, you refuse to go into the dock, or two, shout and commit contempt of court, won't have much impact if they've got a whole life sentence or 30 or 40 years. Now, maybe in cases where the sentences are much smaller, and the prospect of another 2 years may have an impact. But it's really these very high-profile, terrible cases that have caught the public imagination, and I'm not sure there's actually an easy answer to this, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the head of the POA, the Prison Officers Association, already saying the very nature of their crimes means they don't care.
Yeah,
that's part of the problem. And also quoting the case of Joanna Dennehy, one of those other women, of which there are now 4, who've been given a whole life tariff, who laughed and smirked in her own sentencing.
She murdered 3 men in East Anglia, I think, from memory.
Another awful case.
Yeah.
The other change today in the Lucy Letby case is, presumably we expected it, that there's now it's going to be a public inquiry, which has now been upgraded to a statutory inquiry, which means that compulsion is now involved for witnesses and so on.
Yes, and I think this is important. So the government, when it first announced the inquiry, they sort of said, we'll consult with the families, we'll do what the families really want. And it was clear, it seems, from consultation and conversation with them, they really wanted this to be on a statutory footing. And that means that the most important element of what changes then is that witnesses can be compelled to give evidence. And because this is supposed to paint a picture not just of the specific, moments at which perhaps Letby could have been captured or understood, but also the infrastructure and decision-making that sort of created a culture in which it was sort of an assumption of, oh, I'm sure this is all absolutely fine and just a misunderstanding, or however, those witnesses may characterise it. I think that's quite important for understanding the NHS culture around accountability, which I think is going to be important for ensuring really that more NHS managers across the country are very aware of this possible, very slight, but possible scenario that could arise, and are therefore more on the lookout for presumption of action rather than inaction.
Yeah, the Health Secretary, Stephen Barclay, got it wrong at the beginning. There were quite a lot of voices saying that you're going to have to make this statutory because of this power to compel people to appear and also call those documents. I don't think he was in any way involved in a cover-up, or he didn't want the investigation to be thorough. He thought, look, we can do it more quickly this way. But I think it was just wrong certainly with the families. But also, it's not just those who lost their babies. It's all of us, because we all have a vested interest in getting to the bottom of what went wrong, how it can be fixed and preventing it happening again. And I think
it doesn't have to be this scenario. It could be any scenario.
Oh, yeah.
Where things aren't looking quite right on any ward or any unit, quite frankly.
Oh, yeah. Whether you're near the cradle or the coffin. Whether you're very young or very old, somewhere in the middle. No, we all have a vested interest in the NHS working and healing people and fixing them, not having rogue members of staff going around killing people.
And the former, well, now Chancellor, former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt was quite interesting on this around like mistakes that get made, which obviously happens in all walks of life. And fortunately, if I make a mistake right now, your readers will, audience will forgive me. But in those situations, like really dire situations can happen. And how do you create more of a culture of accountability whilst not making doctors and nurses feel as though they're under this ridiculous amount of duress and they can't do a single thing wrong? And that's quite an important and difficult balance to strike. And I think that hopefully this inquiry will help and really actually just help managers as well to figure out how to get that balance.
It's life and death in the NHS. And with justice, and there's a large element of justice in this, it's got to be seen to be done properly.
Well, Jeremy Hunt was fully bought into Matthew Syed's black box thinking, which is if you investigate an airline crash, why don't you do it in the NHS? Which kind of makes sense in all organisations, doesn't it? To the Times now, you use the word rogue. Kevin, rogue police to be sacked on the spot under new powers. Tell us about this. Yeah,
it seems to be the day when the government's trying to catch up and do all those things it should have done some time ago. The opposition were calling for them, and they haven't. And this one is to make it easier, essentially, for police chiefs to sack officers who are guilty of crimes or gross misconduct. And Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, has been lobbying for this for some time. Chris Philp, the Police Minister, is finally going to announce it, make it easier. Now, we don't know the details, and that's where the devil always is. And how will it operate? Now, police officers, if you commit gross misconduct or an offence, you can be sacked on the spot, as the Times put it in a headline. You'd still have a right of appeal, just like anybody else would in law. You've got to have whatever the charges are examined, and they've got to be held against you. And proved against you if you're going to be fired. So
this is after the high-profile cases of David Carrick and Wayne Couzens, and elements of the Wayne Couzens story where he could have been stopped before. That's the really critical bit here, isn't it?
Yeah, and in a way, like, this is the most important story we're probably going to discuss tonight, right? Because it cannot be stressed enough, not just the importance of trust in policing for actually making policing work, but also, like, this has been accelerated by the two cases that we've just mentioned. But actually, I think that the lack of trust in the policing has been going on for quite some time, and I think it really does impact the ability for police to keep people safe. And it frustrates me a lot that a lot of the conversation around policing centres on, funding and is this the right funding? But I think there are really good police forces and really bad police forces that are really kind of abstract from the question of funding, and we should really look at some of the things that you need to do to deliver the kind of integrity to the system that really matters. And these are not it doesn't seem to me, isolated cases of poor behaviour, misconduct, severe abuses of power, and more rigour around that is absolutely essential, whether that's about stop and search, whether that's about, domestic violence, whether that's about, cases such as these. And this is really an important thing that almost has you thinking, why wasn't this done sooner?
But it's in the interest of good police officers, a huge number of good police officers, that the bad ones are out. And Rowley's talked about scores and scores of those in the Met. He wants to get out. He's saying he can't. And he complains that the current system, which often is sort of lawyer-led, is too soft, he says. But if there are accusations against a police officer, they should be dealt with in a normal way, like anybody else in a workplace.
OK, well, the connected stories, the idea of trust and visibly doing the right thing in justice, in the health service and in the police service, sort of running through the theme so far. There's more to come, though. Other stories, too. And over the years, tax cuts have been a frequent Conservative election promise. You probably know. But this time, things may be different. Back with that and more in just a moment.
So the SS Express was an incredibly important ship for the local islanders of both the Orkney and the Shetland, and it was used to go and supply the islands with normal goods and produce from the mainland, and it would come up from Leith in Scotland to Kirkwall and offload its general goods. And this was happening during World War I. It was a replacement for the wreck of the ship, the Ruby, which actually the same team of researchers found a couple of years ago. And it was so important for the islanders because it gave them the actual produce they required to survive. It collided with the HMS Grenville, or I'll rephrase that, HMS Grenville collided with it. And it was at night. It wasn't known what had actually struck. It never knew that it had actually struck the SS Express. And it was due to the tireless research of Kevin Heath from Lost in Waters Deep, who went through all the wreck research, the sonar imagery, and found an image of what looked like a wreck on the seabed in an approximate position to where HMS Grenville believed it had struck a vessel. That enabled us an opportunity on an expedition which we were conducting up in the between Orkney and Shetland, to go and visit it, to go and try and create a positive identification. So it took a long time to identify because, one, we needed the sonar imagery of the local area. That's only become more apparent over the last decade, 2 decades, where we've had the facilities and the vessels to actually go and create the sonar imagery. But also all the other conditions. You need an incredible dive team. You need an incredible boat or diving support vessel, which enables us to go and do it. And literally, you need the weather and the conditions. We had all of them, and with the great research provided by Lost in Waters Deep, enabled us to go down and positively identify this remarkably historically important for the Orkney Islands wreck. The next plan, if it was possible, would be to actually create kind of 3D imagery of the wreck, and then it kind of brings it back to life as such. And more importantly is what the relatives would like to do. It's offering them closure to what was their grave of their ancestors and relatives, and we want to make sure that we respect that in the highest possible way.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me once again, Kevin Maguire and Anita Boateng. Welcome back to both of you. To the eye, tax cuts. Here we go again. I feel like I hear this quite regularly. The Chancellor rules out any red meat for angry Tory MPs. Why are they still angry, Anita?
Well, because we all know the tax burden is high, and it's higher than it's been for a very long time. And this is really,
Second World War.
You know, Jeremy Hunt is going to want to, you know, roll the pitch and manage expectations coming into the autumn, particularly because, you know, it's highly likely, because of the higher inflation world that we're in, that we're going to end up with some form of a windfall of some description at the budget. So the Chancellor has some wriggle room for what he wants to do with that money. And it's kind of quite clear that Jeremy Hunt does not want to cut taxes. And he talked earlier in the summer about he not countenancing tax cuts if they make the battle against inflation harder, because he knows inflation is the thing that ultimately makes every single Briton in the country poorer. And that's the thing that's really biting, whether it's food inflation or energy inflation. And he does not want to allow that to remain for 1 second longer. So I think this is, once again, Jeremy Hunt's attempt to sort of, I mean, I don't think he's particularly briefed this, but like trying to hold that line that we're not going to, you know, expect tax cuts now, in the hope that with inflation down, coming into the new year, pre-election, there might be an opportunity for him to reconsider that point.
He'll come up with the tax bribes at the election, won't he? He'll do it next year, not this year.
Definitely save it if you keep your powder dry for now.
Yeah, and I think the only people who really are shouting now is the Tory right, who backed Liz Truss, and that was not a disaster, wasn't it? If we go back to that budget, but remember then, one of the tax cuts she was planning was a 1p cut in income tax, which Labour actually backed at the time, and then were very quiet about it. And of course, they'll just back whatever he comes up with next time on income tax, even if it's going to be ridiculous for the public finances. But if he's three economic pledges, stop the boats, oh, that's going well. Cut NHS waiting lists, oh, that's going well. He didn't promise tax cuts. He said grow the economy. It's broadly flatlining. Reduce debt. Well, it's about over 100% now, which I think the highest since 1961. And what was the third one? But it wasn't.
Debt, growth and inflation.
Yeah, it was inflation, big inflation, which is probably the one he's had most success on by crashing the economy.
Well.
OK. Very quick, I'm going to just read out some of the headlines on Prince Harry. Harry takes a swipe at royals over lack of support after Afghanistan, landing a fresh blow to the royal family by claiming he had no support network. And the biggest struggle for me was that no one around me really helped me, saying it brought back all the memories of the death of his mother when he was 12. And then Jan Moyer in the Mail, every time I want to warm to Prince Harry, out comes that huffy sense of victimhood. You've got 10 seconds, so...
But, look, whether you're for or against them, the Invictus Games are a good thing. But I think welcome to the real grim world. I think most people who served in the forces complain about the lack of support when they come out. He's no different. He's highlighting a big feeling. So I think he deserves some credit for that, rather than saying it's victimhood on this occasion.
My defence is it doesn't look like a swipe at the royals particularly.
OK. We will talk more about that later. Anita Boateng and Kevin Maguire, thank you both very much. Here's the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, further showers this week, more general thundery rain possible in the southeast. Central Britain will have quite a cloudy and in places damp start tomorrow, while northern Scotland will see showers and longer spells of rain. Muggy south of England can expect a few thunderstorms too. Thundery downpours threatening southeast England tomorrow morning. The extent is a little uncertain. Elsewhere, it will be mainly dry with sunny spells, but there will be showers around, prolonged in the north. Cloudy skies mean it will be cooler for much of southern England, and the afternoon looks fine for many. Overnight, plenty of chances in many areas to see the blue supermoon. Good luck.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.